Thanks for joining us for this week's Health News You Can Use. I'm Lindsay Stish. This week, we're talking about children's mental health through the pandemic. I'm joined today by Amanda Davis, Director of Intake Services with St. Luke's Hospital Crittenton Children's Center. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Well, since the pandemic began, more Americans, including children, have struggled with depression and anxiety. COVID-19 can affect children and adolescents in many ways. Beyond getting physically sick, social, emotional, and mental well-being can be impacted as well. According to the CDC, 1 in 4 young adults have struggled with suicidal thoughts since the pandemic started. Amanda, the mental health impact of COVID-19 is affecting youth at an alarming rate. What's contributed to the rise of depression, anxiety, and suicide in the younger population?
There are a couple of different things that have contributed to that rise in depression, anxiety, and suicide. The first is probably the lack of social support. We know that social support is one of the biggest factors in helping to mediate depression and anxiety, and we just can't see the people that we love and trust in person anymore. Probably the next thing is just the same thing that's affecting all of us, which is that sense of uncertainty and just not knowing what to expect or how to plan for anything.
One key to helping children cope is their parents' ability to recognize signs of depression and anxiety. What are some warning signs parents should look for?
One of the first warning signs you should really look for is any kind of major change in your child. So whether that be mood, behavior, or just changes in basic things like their eating and sleeping patterns. One of the biggest things we see with adolescents in particular is an increased sense of irritability.
And children and adolescents tend to be impulsive when having thoughts of suicide. What are some seemingly harmless items that can be dangerous if accessible to children?
There are several items in the home that I would really suggest limiting access to if you have kiddos in the home that you might be concerned about in terms of mental health. The first is kind of obvious, and that would be firearms. We want to make sure that they don't have access to them or access to anything like bullets or things that you would use to load them. The second would be things like alcohol, just because that makes you a lot more vulnerable to those impulsive thoughts. And then any kind of medication, both over the counter and prescription. We want to make sure that there's just enough accessible if they have a headache or stomach ache, but no more than that.
Now, with the vaccines, there is some hope in sight for the end of the pandemic, but it will still be a while before things can return to normal. What can parents do to help their children through the rest of the pandemic?
I think there are several things that parents can do to help their children through the rest of this. The first is to make sure that they as parents are doing okay. When we're not okay, our children just don't really have a chance to be okay either. So making sure you're taking care of yourself, getting your own support, and really checking in on your own thoughts and feelings is probably the first thing to do. The next thing I would do is to make sure that you're checking in with your kiddos repeatedly. I think this has gone on for quite some time, and so it's important to keep checking in as things change and to keep giving them updates on what to expect.
Are any populations more at risk?
There are a few populations that are more at risk to mental health issues during this pandemic. The first would be any populations that were at risk before the pandemic. They are still just as vulnerable, if not more so. The second group are those where their social connections were very important, especially if they don't have a sense of belonging or acceptance in the family home that they have been staying in during the pandemic. And then the third group would be people of color. We are concerned for two reasons for them. One, the risk of suicide has really increased in the African American population, especially among youth and young adults over the last few years. In addition, we know that effects of the pandemic have been harder on people of color. They're more likely to have lost jobs or to have economic stressors. And then with all of the events at the Capitol and throughout the summer, they have really been affected more than the average citizen.
Now, what should parents do if a child expresses these feelings, and what are some resources that are available?
If a parent is concerned or hears something from their child that makes them worry about that, there are a couple of things you should do. The first is that you can very directly and openly ask them if they're having thoughts about killing themselves. We know that this doesn't increase the likelihood of them doing anything, and it actually helps them to feel calmer because you cared enough to ask an incredibly hard question. The next thing I would do is look for professional help. There's lots of options, even during the pandemic, Most providers are doing virtual therapy. There are virtual groups that are happening, and there's always crisis lines for every county in Missouri and Kansas.
And what resources are available to help with stress during the pandemic?
There are lots of different resources available to help with stress. Many of the mindfulness apps out there have offered free memberships during this time. If you go to the Missouri Department of Mental Health website, there are some free resources available, as well as just looking for social media groups that really meet your belief system and provide a sense of support and community when we can't see each other in person.
Now, turning to recent events and riots at our nation's capital and the stress that can add, how can parents talk to their children about what's happening?
The very first thing we want to do when there has been a stressful event in the world or media is to check with ourselves. You never want to approach that conversation with your child if you're not feeling okay yourself in that moment. Once you've kind of figured out that you're in a good place to have that conversation, ask your child what they know about it. Sometimes they get information from sources like friends or social media or even the news that are either not quite accurate or that they've interpreted in a different way. And then you want to check and see what questions they have. Answer those questions as honestly and age appropriately as you can. And then last, you want to focus on the helpers in the situation. So the best example is the congressman who is helping to clean up the Capitol at the end of the night, picking up trash on his own to help beautify the place that was really important to him.
And lastly, what's your final takeaway message for parents today?
I think my final takeaway is that as this pandemic has stretched out longer and longer, I think that we've adjusted in some ways, and it's harder to notice when things are maybe going downhill again because everything seems so different. So don't be afraid to ask your kiddos directly about what they're feeling and thinking, and then to make sure you're taking care of yourself as well.
Well, thank you again, Amanda, for joining us.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Next week, we'll be talking about COVID-19 vaccines, including the differences between the various vaccines, as well as concerns and myths. You can stay up to date with all the latest developments on the COVID pandemic and other health news from St. Luke's at stlukeskc.org/news or by following us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time on Health News You Can Use.